we have to face reality that in order for 8 billion people to survive on Earth, we would need in the first world to reduce our consumption by as much as 80%. The first half of that is easy. The next is going to be a bit more difficult, but it requires a change in attitude, a change of mind, and a complete change in the nature of the fundamental values underpinning our modern culture.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Stanley Wu, as Michael mentioned. I'm the coordinator for Omega and the Resilience Project. Omega is the Resilience Funders Network, a collaboration working on the global polycrisis. We're joined today by Paul Ehrlich, Gerardo Ceballos, Joan Diamond, three of the paper's authors. And we've asked Nate Hagens and Bill Rees, two eminent thinkers in the field, to respond to the paper. This webinar is hosted by Michael Lerner, and we're looking forward to a conversation around the recently published study titled Underestimating the Challenges Avoiding a Ghastly Future. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Millennial Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, Cran's Foresight Analysis Nexus, and the New School at Commonweal. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michael Lerner. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley, and welcome to you all. This call is a special honor and privilege for all of us. This is an extraordinarily important paper that we really think provides a summary of what is happening to the Earth and to humanity at a very high level. And so we're simply thrilled to participate with you in hearing three of the authors and two commentators on it. Each of the authors will have, and the commentators will have a little over 5 minutes to make their presentations. And when they stray too far from that, I will ask them to summarize. With that, I will introduce Joan Diamond, who will introduce the call and the speakers. Joan is the executive director of the Millennial Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere at Stanford, and of the Foresight Analysis Nexus Initiative, or the FAN Initiative, as well as a core member of the Omega leadership team. With that, Joan Diamond.
Thank you, Michael. I'll begin by repeating Michael and Stanley's welcome. The Omega Collaborative look forward to working with you as we in this room, and I consider it all one room, respond to the challenges laid out in Ghastly. This webinar is a beginning and not an event. Underestimating the challenge of avoiding a ghastly future has its own history. It was originally conceived by Paul Ehrlich and Graham Pike in Australia as a call to arms, a challenge to scientists, a blazing, merciless statement of the failure of the scientific community to convey the very dire future ahead if action isn't taken now. Are scientists just cowards? Is there something more nuanced about the culture of the scientific community blocking progress? Or is the lack of awareness, given the strong science evidence, driven by other factors? Eventually, what came to be 17 authors saw our path, lay out a comprehensive, not too long, absolutely honest and accessible description of humanity's challenge, and bring it to the global community. The millions of people who at some level know something is very wrong and that future generations are threatened. If we, the authors, could describe the human predicament in an easily understood way, then we could invite you to share in and to lead much of the response. This is an invitation, I won't say to the party, but at least to the gathering of creative, caring, intrepid souls who can fearlessly bring the future forward, confront it, and shift it from its current course. Today, for this journey, we are joined by, as Michael mentioned, two of the authors and two respondents. Paul Ehrlich is often thought of as one of the grandfathers, leaders, great names. I know you don't like that, Paul, but, and for almost 70 years, has been educating us, providing opportunities for us to learn about the serious threats to civilization, the existential issues that are threatening all of us and future generations. I could go on about Paul's bio, but I think that's enough for now, and I encourage you to find out more about him. Gerardo Ceballos joins us from Mexico. He's an ecologist and conservationist, very well known for his work in Stop Extinction, and I encourage you to look at that most recent work, and Animal Ecology and Conservation. He joined the faculty of the Institute of Ecology at the Universidad Nacional of Mexico in 1989, where he's currently still a professor. He has been the president of the Mexican Mammal Society and is a member of both the National Academy of Sciences, that's the US National Academy of Sciences, and the National Academy of Arts and Sciences. William or Bill Rees, who is will be our first respondent this morning, is a bioecologist, an ecological economist, and the former director and professor emeritus of the University of British Columbia's School of Community and Regional Planning. Bill is perhaps best known as the originator and co-developer with his graduate student, Mathis Wakanal, who is one of the authors of the paper, for the Global Footprint, which has been published in 8 languages, including Chinese. It's one of the primary tools that at all ages, people, children, students in the US can use to understand their role in the existential crisis facing us. Nate Hagens is a public intellectual, founder of the Institute for the Study of Energy and Our Future, among other organizations. He has appeared on PBS, BBC, ABC, NPR, and has lectured around the world. He comes to this issue from not the traditional academic, scientific ecology environment perspective. He holds a master's degree in finance with honors from the University of Chicago, then a PhD in natural resources from the University of Vermont. Nate was the president of Sanctuary Asset Management and a vice president at the investment firms of Solomon Brothers and Lehman Brothers before he saw the light and the path to some ways for us to engage in the existential crises facing us. With those much too brief introductions, let me turn the microphone over to Paul, who will give our first presentation.
First rave. Very nice to see all of you. Graham and I actually were stirred into interest in this by a statement or an article actually written by Jim Hansen some years ago about the reticence of scientists. And Jim hit that button because he had sent an article to the PNAS, the Journal of the National Academy of Sciences, and the editors objected to the fact that he called the climate disruption situation dangerous. They said they didn't want terrible words like dangerous in it, even though I would have used catastrophic instead. And so we started to work on this with a lot of different people, and it turned out that a lot of different people, most of my colleagues, are scared witless of what's going on in the world now. And I think it was all summarized for me recently we just got rid of, as some of you may have heard, of a kakistocracy in the United States, although not entirely. We still have a lot in it. And the new president said that he was going to deal with 4 things, if I recall correctly. One was the pandemic, which has been totally bungled by the previous administration and remains bungled. And then there is the economic fallout of that. And then there's also our institutional racism. And then he said climate change. And this struck me as being typical of a really bright, interested, humane individual raised in our disastrous education system, who doesn't focus on, as nobody else does in the political realm, of the fact that the first three all become moot if the climate situation goes in the direction that it's going now, and that basically the federal government, just like Stanford University should, and I suspect even UBC, focusing its main thrust on the fact that we have these existential threats that go far beyond the climate disruption situation. As a recent book by Shanna Swan projects that we may have a zero sperm count in human beings by the middle of the century, which certainly would be a solution to the population problem. Gerardo will be able to tell you in some detail the fact that we're having a catastrophic loss of biodiversity, and that the biodiversity is absolutely essential to human beings doing some things they like to do, such as eat, for example. And of course, we're going to have Nate tell us he has got the closest contact of anybody I know and understanding of the fact that most economists are daydream believers, and that we should be shutting down departments of economics and certainly business schools if we're going to have a chance of surviving. So there's lots and lots to talk about. And what most of us are focused on now in one form or another, and I suspect even the same kind of group will do it, is on what kind of responses we should be generating to this catastrophic threat to humanity, not just a civilization with our mutually assured imbecility with nuclear weapons. We may actually manufacture ourselves, or actually through climate disruption, an end to Homo sapiens. That's less likely than an end to our civilization, but it certainly is possible. And at that point, since there are 5 people waiting to cut my head off if I go beyond 5 minutes, I'll pass it on. I'll pass it back to Joni. I like passing things back to Joni.
Thank you, Paul. And now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Gerardo. And Gerardo, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it's an honor to be talking about this issue. Let me tell you that a few years ago, I was working with Paul Ehrlich at Stanford doing a sabbatical. And then we tried to look at the state of the art in terms of what was the extinction crisis. And we thought that we were going to find out really bad results, extinction rate compared to the previous ones in the last few million years. But when we got the results, we were incredibly surprised to find out that the species, the vertebrate species that we have lost in this century, would have been lost in 10,000 years under the previous normal extinction rates. Even for us, who were expecting to find something bad, it was a shock. And then we sent the paper to publish to Science, and it was rejected because they said that we didn't have any there was no theory of extinction. And because the data, the title that we have chosen, acceleration, the losses of a species, vertebrate species, to send it to Science Advances, we published it and it became viral. It got many millions of people look at the paper. And it was for us a lesson for 2 things. One, first of all, learn that the extinction crisis, the species extinction crisis, it's much more worse than we thought. Even we scientists work the issue was even worse. Second, we learned that as we have been saying in this paper, the community was kind of reluctant to say things in the magnitude that they have to be said. But third, the amount of people, it was in the Le Monde, the New York Times, CBS, NBS, everywhere, we got more than together, the authors, more probably than 300 or 400 properly about this issue. So then we start to work not only on a species extinction, because we realize that focusing only on a species doesn't give us the proper scenario. So what we did is look, in 2017, we published this paper on population extinction. And this was very important for two reasons. On the one hand, what we found and were able to tell, and it also was also a big success in terms of the acceptance by scientists and non-scientists, was that we're losing population much faster than a species, obviously. And by losing populations at the local and regional scales, is like a whole extinction. If we lose jaguars in Mexico, it doesn't matter that there are jaguars in other countries, because the services provided for humans and the role they play in ecosystems are gone. So it was very important for us to emphasize that populations extinctions are rather important to focus, because also that's the way to maintain genetic variability and so on. And it's also one way that countries who don't have a large, high biodiversity can take care of their biodiversity. We sent the paper for publication, and again they said in this journal that the title was too big. It was too alarmist. And I say to the editor, look, as a scientist, we have the responsibility to be very straight with the data. So we're not allowed to be alarmist. But on the other hand, it will be unethical not to say things the way they are. And the reply of the editor said, go ahead with your title. We called it the paper Biological Annihilation via the sixth mass extinction. So in a nutshell, what we have been able to put in this paper is to focus on two major problems: the loss of biodiversity on the one hand, and that we have entered the sixth mass extinction. And in this particular case, I think what we were able to put in this paper and to raise, try to raise awareness, is that if we lose populations and species, we continue to lose it at the rate it. There is no way we will be able to maintain civilization the way we have it.
Well, thank you, Gerardo. We look forward to exploring that further in the coming hour. So we've heard from Paul, we've heard from Gerardo, and now we're going to hear from Bill, and then after that, Nate, who are respondents. We're not authors of the paper, but are leading thinkers, writers, intellectuals, researchers in the field. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bill, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Joan. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to the over 200 guests that have joined us. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to spread the message of this very important paper. I think it's an excellent summary of the current state of affairs. I don't think anything like it has really been published before. It pulls together the recent literature in a very compelling manner, but compelling to scientists and probably most of the people who are in attendance at this particular discussion. This paper is based on the Enlightenment tradition of how human beings ought to respond rationally or reasonably to an obvious and accelerating crisis. Now, I have said as clearly as I can that from a scientific point of view, as a scientist, that this is an incredibly compelling paper. On the other hand, we have to face a certain reality. And I want to share some slides with you that bring out this reality. And the first point is that the fact of the matter is that humankind is not primarily a rational species. Obviously, we're capable of reason, we're capable of high intellect, we're capable of reasoning from the evidence, but it's not the dominant means by which we conduct human affairs. And this is not a secret. If we go back to Gustave Le Bon, who was probably the first psychologist who considered these kinds of questions back in the late 19th century, a wonderful little book you can download from the internet called The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. And for this purpose, I've just pulled one quote from it, and there are many like this. Quote, "The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduces them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim." So people are really masters of self-delusion. And just as the editors of the journals that Gerardo was talking about tended to decline papers that seemed alarmist or whatever, we have a predisposition to cover up those things that we find unpleasant. Another excellent source of how this plays out in the real world is the Pulitzer Prize winning American historian Barbara Tuchman, who in her book, The March of Folly, describes this behavior as wooden-headedness. And so wooden-headedness plays a remarkably large role in government. It consists in assessing a situation of preconceived fixed notions. And that can be ideology, religion, it can be even scientific theory, while ignoring contrary signs. It is acting according to wish, while not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts. So here we have a marvelous paper full of undeniable facts, but it doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to pay any attention to them. Now, there's actually a neurocognitive explanation for this. We now know that if a person is exposed to repeated experiences or repeated thought patterns in the course of his development, these literally help to shape the synaptic circuits in the brain. And once these circuits are established, this is really the source of habitual thinking and habitual action. People seek out compatible experiences. They seek out compatible people. Look how the social media have solidified this view. People are constantly in echo chambers talking among themselves about delusions that they share. And, quote, when faced with information that does not agree with their preformed internal neural structures, we tend to deny, discredit, reinterpret, or forget that information. And that's a quote from Bruce Wexler's excellent little book called Brain and Culture on this topic. So we have a problem of denial, and it's partially due to our cognitive experience. Here's a wonderful editorial cartoon that captures this perfectly. The problem with your reasoned solutions, Paul and Gerardo, is that they don't fit my preconceived notions of the problem. So there's a bigger problem and that is in the past probably 50 years, since the Thatcher, Reagan, and in Canada, Brian Mulroney era, the population has literally been socially engineered to ignore reality. So there's been an ongoing program of promotion of the ideas associated with neoliberal economics, extreme individualism, and so on and so forth, precisely toward developing these synaptic circuits that help us to deny reality, so that we seek out the reassuring lie rather than the inconvenient truth as posed in this paper. So today we find that politics is increasingly influenced by neoliberal ideology, religious fundamentalism, climate change denial, anti-intellectualism, and other forms of magical thinking. Everything that flies in the face of the evidence presented in this excellent paper. And I think it's important that the Oxford dictionaries back in 2016 coined, or didn't coin, but chose as their word of the year, post-truth, which they define as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than are appeals to emotion and personal belief. So again, this underscores the general sense that humans are not primarily rational, particularly in groups, but we tend to be more responsive to emotional appeals or instinctive analyses. So this really is a new age of science denial and magical thinking. I've used the term endarkenment to describe what seems to be happening these days. This is how it shows up in the real world. These are data from NOAA, the uptick in carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere over the last, 60 years or so. And what we see here is a steady, in fact, exponentially increasing increase in global atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. But in that period of 50 years or so, we've seen 34 climate conferences addressing this problem, a half dozen major international agreements, and they've had virtually no effect on the direction in which this is going. And you'll notice another earlier warning to the world community was limits to growth. Already, 50 years ago now, just as alarming in many respects as the current paper. Following that was the first world scientists' warning to humanity in 1992. So none of these major events, these major historical events designed to address the problem, seem to have any effect on the continuous uptick in our climate dilemma. And just to go back to that limits to growth, this 50-year-old document, in the last decade or so, there's been at least 3 other studies of what has actually happened in the world after the rejection of the limits to growth model. So the base case or standard run is the green line. The purple dots are the data from real world analyses of trends that have occurred since the rejection of limits to growth as a reasonable description of reality. And in fact, you can see that reality is following fairly closely the standard run of that limits to growth analysis, which puts us on course for a mid-century collapse of the global economy, resources, population, the human enterprise, as it were. I'm not predicting this, but I am stating that the science suggests the direction in which we are going. So that ends the slide projection. I think there's a couple of other points. If I haven't run out of time, nobody's warned me yet.
Bill, you're at about 7 minutes.
Okay, then. In that case, I'll reserve my other comments for our general discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill. I feel like I should just go and sit and absorb that for a few minutes, and look forward to exploring it further in the discussion time. So I'd now like to turn the screen over to Nate Hagens. And Nate, this is quite a picture here, and I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Joni. I've never done a 5-minute talk in my life, so I'll dispense with the jokes and get right into it. It's also not a funny topic. So I loved the paper. I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. I'm going to try to give a macro framework of where that fits into our socioeconomic situation. I'm going to give 3 core themes in 5 minutes. The human metabolism, a systemic risk summary, and a choreography with a few suggestions for response. So first of all, energy is the currency of life. The origins of capitalism might be found in nature because there's an energy and investment and an energy return for all biological organisms. There's a scaling law that relates the metabolism of biological organisms and structures to their mass. And it ends up being their mass to the 3/4 power. And this actually also applies to human systems. The global human enterprise uses energy at around 3/4 to the power of our size. So a few hundred years ago, we happened upon fossil sunlight that was stored underground, and we all have been alive during the upper part of this curve, which I refer to as the carbon pulse. Right now, humanity is generating constant metabolism of 17 terawatts, which is equal to 170 billion 100-watt light bulbs turned on all the time. This is because we're accessing fossil carbon and hydrocarbons 10 million times faster than they were sequestered. 1 barrel of oil does 4.5 years of my or anyone on this call's physical work. And the global economy uses 100 billion barrel of oil equivalents of fossil fuels every year, which works out to a labor equivalent of 500 billion human workers relative to the 4 or 5 billion actual human workers. So this explains some of the data in Gerardo's paper, where a few hundred years ago, relative to today, we've increased the biomass of megafauna on the planet by 7-fold due to this bolus of ancient productivity. Most of this is our livestock, where humans and our livestock now outweigh wild mammals 50-1 approximately. So in effect, especially oil, but all global fuels are acting as the hemoglobin of a globally interconnected economic system. And no one's in charge of this system. Global human culture, when we cooperate at family levels, at corporations, at nation states towards getting our basic needs, we end up tethering to energy, and we're becoming globally an energy dissipating structure, something I liken to an amoeba, a mindless amoeba. So this is kind of a scary proposition, but I think this gets to some of the conclusions in the Ghastly paper. And I've spent a lot of time in the last year dealing with high-level US politicians, and I now really believe this to be true. Given this framing, there is no one driving the bus, not politicians, not billionaires. We're enthralled to this economic system pursuing growth, and it can't be stopped until it stops of its own accord. Trying to degrow, trying to put prices on carbon and shrink our economy is akin to arguing with a forest fire, which gets to the graph that Bill already showed. We've been arguing to no avail for 50 years. So effectively, our economies are now growth constrained, and we're going to kick any and all political social cans forward in order to keep growing. Well, with that framework, what is not likely to happen? What's unlikely to happen is growing the economy and mitigating climate change and the sixth mass extinction discussed in this paper. Growing the economy by replacing fossil carbon with renewables. Humans en masse choosing to keep carbon in the ground, and in governments embracing limits to growth before we're already past limits to growth. Under this superorganism framing, what is likely to happen? We're going to grow our gross energy while the net energy declines. We're going to have massive monetary creation by governments and central banks, modern monetary theory, et cetera, universal basic income, populism, nationalism. We're going to continue to keep kicking cans until we hit a wall. So where's the risk on this? So our culture is, we care about nature, we care about climate change, but we're energy blind. We don't see that we're part of a system, and en masse, we're drawing down the principle and considering it as interest. So getting back to the themes in Gerardo and Paul's paper, if we think of the carbon pulse, the environmental impact of this is in two categories. One is the metabolism of the human heat engine. So we use all this energy, and the waste stream, the CO2, goes to the atmosphere and the ocean. But there's a separate category, which is the toxics, the fact that we're losing insect biomass at 2.5 a year. There's so much plastics in the ocean. And as our fossil carbon declines, these curves may go in different directions. After we peak in fossil carbon, and I would argue strongly that global peak oil was 2018, and that's a whole nother discussion. But I think the metabolism impact of humans is peaking now. And so our CO2 is peaking in the next decade. But as our economies decline and we try to get our same neurotransmitters en masse that we have, will our other impacts go up on the environment? An open question. So we've arrived at a species level story, but it's not yet integrated. Gerardo did a great job of integrating the environmental damage in this paper, but that's just one part of the story. We have finance and geopolitics and climate change and renewable energy and all these other things. We as a culture live with lots of islands of expertise separated by an ocean of nonsense. And we need to fly up high enough and look down at what's happening. The other problem alluded to in the paper was that this story is complex, it's threatening, it's in the future, it's abstract. There's no key people on television telling us this. There's no easy answers. So it's the perfect storm for our evolved tribal minds to ignore or deny, which makes it almost impossible to have this story be discussed on the halls of Congress or on MSNBC News. It's a real pickle. Okay, so where do we go from here? I think given the metabolism underpinning our civilization, there's a disparity between what we should do and what we're going to have to do. So in my analysis, I think we're headed for financial recalibration because we've been kicking the can using debt for over 50 years. We need to plan for a smaller economy, but we're getting social signals that all these things are going to be solved with a growing economy. So in my opinion, we have a series of social, environmental, political challenges that we can't solve right now. We have to solve them sequentially. And as you've seen, even with the election of Biden, our country, the United States, is 50-50 pretty much, or 51-49. And we have some dire risk for democracy and social cohesion. We first have to navigate that and get some sort of unity in our country to keep social dialogues in government intact. Then we have a date in the next decade with a financial calibration back down to the biophysical energy and materials underpinning it. And then if we navigate that, I think we have a chance at sustainability and governance. Real briefly, here's 3 ideas that my teams and organizations are working on. One is, at the moment of this financial recalibration, we're going to have massive deflation. At that moment, we could tax not only carbon, but all non-renewable resources and remove a tax on human labor. It would do more for climate change and most other environmental impacts than any activism of the last 50 years. But it could never be enacted right now because it would be too unpopular. It would imply a shrinking economy, but we can build blueprints and constituency ahead of time. We also undeniably need to move away from being a heat engine as our cultural aspiration. GDP was never meant to be our goal. So we need to move towards more well-being. How are we actually doing? And I've got a state level project working on this. And finally, I don't believe we're ever going to directly communicate these challenges to sitting politicians unless we're in a crisis, because this is not on their job description. So I think to create networks of people, high-level people, philanthropists, former political leaders, business leaders, et cetera, that integrate how the situation fits together, and then they in turn can come up with blueprints, break glass in case of emergency plans, and hand them off to people in a credible way when the situation warrants it. So in short, in conclusion, we've had a series of social contracts in our species history, and we're now approaching a species level social contract. We are not alive in normal times. And for all of you on this call, thank you for joining. For some part of your personal, professional life, please consider service to the future. Thank you.
Nate, thank you so much. And what an extraordinary collection of presentations. I'm so glad we are recording this. I really think the paper is a historic one, and the authors deserve great credit. I think Bill Rees did a remarkable job of reminding us that the logic is there, the science is there, but humanity prefers folly in one form or another, prefers beliefs that are not grounded in reason. And Nate has given us an equally brilliant presentation, sort of expanding beyond the paper in terms of all the forces that are at work and some of the possibilities for a post-growth future. So with that, we are going to the question period. And I think, Joan, let me just start with you. You've listened to all of this, and I just want to ask if there's anything you think we missed, simply in terms of what we ought to cover from the presenters and the commentators.
I don't think there's anything we've missed, but we've been faced with a challenge, which is how to bridge the knowledge we have with the action that's needed. And, and that's an open challenge. That's an open landscape. Nate gave us some ideas of directions. I know that and believe that Bill and Paul and Gerardo also have some ideas, and most likely, many of the people listening, participating in this meeting have ideas. But the big issue facing us is the gap between the two. Now that we have the knowledge, it's easy, it's accessible. I mean, it's been there for decades, but it's at a different level now. How do we turn that into meaningful action in the time we have left?
Thank you, Joan. And I'm going to ask each of the presenters and commentators to just briefly add a few words, and then also welcome all of you to put questions in the chat function, not in the Q&A, please. We're following the chat function. Paul, as you've heard everybody speak to this, any brief reflections?
Well, the first thing is I got to second everything Bill said. It's a struggle that actually many of us are still in the middle of, recognizing, for example, the role of emotion in trying to get things done. This idiotic, I had a big fight with Al Gore. He got me to a meeting where the the mission was to get the scientific information to people faster. And I told them it's not going to make any damn difference how fast you get it to them, because they're not evidence-based. We're a small group animal, and as there's a huge literature, by the way, in social psychology that's pertinent to all of this, but ecologists pay no attention. I got Bill Cialdini and a couple of other social psychologists to talk to the Ecological Society of America a few years ago to try and convince them to stop being so silly, and we totally failed. The big challenge now, basically, as Joan said, is what are your responses to this? As she once said to me, there are no solutions anymore, but there are responses. And that's our big challenge. And a bunch of us are working on it. And Bill has expressed it many times and brilliantly. And frankly, people don't pay attention to him. I pay attention to him, and most of my colleagues pay attention to him, but nobody else does any more than they pay attention to me. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much, Will. And we're getting great questions. I want to ask our panelists to keep your eye on all the great questions that are coming in that you may want to speak to as we go
But the
forward.
elderly can't read them as fast as they're blinked on.
There you go. Gerardo, any reflections on what you've heard? Anything you'd like to add? Please unmute yourself, Gerardo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I have seen several comments and questions. If 2050 is too late for as a goal to stop climate change or species extinction, and based on what we are having working and our research, 2050 will be too late for biodiversity. I think we have been say it in our papers and our lectures that what happened with biodiversity in the next 15, 18 years is what will define what is left of plants, wild plants and animals on this planet, and it will affect us directly. I think it's very important to mention a couple of things here based on the big attention that our papers on extinction has gotten into the public and the big impact of this recent paper. I think it's a plenty of opportunity to try to do something, as Paul says, responses. And one of them, we are working on something called People versus Extinction, that is will be a massive campaign for making people aware of the extinction crisis and the magnitude on the one hand, and it will be both, it will be for scientists, for the politicians, for the public in general. I think we have the bad news is this is going much faster. The good news is still we still have time. Of the window of opportunity is closing.
Thank you very much, Gerardo. And one of the comments in the chat was, will we archive the chat function so that we save it? And the answer is absolutely yes, we will. Bill, you've heard your colleagues here. Obviously, you made an impact with your perspective on the difference between reason and folly. What would you like to add?
Well, I'd like to pick up on something that Nate mentioned, and I think it's the fact that the entire explosion of the human enterprise in just the last 2 centuries, by the way, that's 1/1700th of human history. We've seen a 7-fold increase in human numbers. That's an astonishing result in just 200 years. And yet we take that rate of growth as a culture to be the norm, when in fact we are living in the single most anomalous or abnormal period in human history. And I think that's a fact that really has to penetrate before people in their guts begin to feel what's getting on here. And that's entirely the result of energy use. Another thing that Nate touched on, and it's in the paper as well, but it's related to this energy use. We are on a finite planet. We are one species. And what we've done is used carbon fuel to channel all of the natural sources of energy, as well as minerals and other material resources, into the human purpose. Now, this automatically results in what I call the competitive displacement of non-human species from their ecosystems, their food sources, and so on and so forth. So there is an absolute, direct, and irreversible conflict between the growth in the human enterprise and the conservation of nature in biodiversity presentation. I think everyone listening will have heard any number of politicians argue that there's no inherent conflict between the growth of the economy and the conservation of the environment. That is purest and utter nonsense based on every law of science, from the conservation of mass to the second law of thermodynamics, that you can think of. So we live in a world in which our political thinking is in direct conflict with most of the fundamental laws of nature upon which we are based, that we must fundamentally abide. And the final thing I'd like to say at this point is that the one thing we've omitted in this whole discussion, and also in the paper, is the role of sheer power, political power. And we are in a situation today where in many countries, power is really held by the corporate sector that has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, the growth-oriented status quo that Nate described. So we've seen agency capture, where many of the regulatory agencies, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada and elsewhere, are now controlled by former members of major corporations that used to be regulated by those regulators. So you see this situation where there's an interdigitation of governance with the corporate sector, which has a completely different agenda from the one outlined in this paper, and which is in the interests of the vast majority of human beings. So we have that power dynamic that we need to address, and we need to address it directly. And this, to my mind, is at least as important that scientists speak to power as they speak to the facts of the matter that we've been dealing with here. Finally, the biggest conflict, or I suppose barrier, that we have is the role of social media. I touched on it briefly, but it reinforces these mythical constructs that people glom onto. So almost any crazy idea that comes up now, you can find some internet website or whatever that reinforces people's belief in that kind of magical thinking, mythology, nonsense. But it means that society has lost its sense of collective purpose. There's a breakdown in community. There's no sense of a forward movement for humans as a whole. We've become a kind of disorganized, disheveled group of warring factions around some of the basic ideas that we need to understand in order to move forward and increase the possibilities of cultural survival on Earth. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Bill. Nate, you clearly, thank you, Bill. Nate, you clearly in 7 minutes touched on many of the points that you've expanded on at great and important length in your work. As you've heard your colleagues here, what would you add?
Well, I think, you know, we've arrived at a point where many more people understand the problems, and now we have to look at solutions. But it's like driving in a snowstorm. You don't look at the car ahead of you. You got to look at the brake lights of 2 or 3 cars ahead of you. And I think that's what philanthropists and activists need to do, because we cannot directly assault the superorganism in this way. We're not going to solve climate change by just switching to renewables. We're going to just add more renewables to our system. I really learned last year. I mean, I got to speak to some of the highest level politicians in the United States, or their chiefs of staff. And they have they trust me, and they know that I'm smart and that I care, but they don't know that I care about other species. They don't know that I know about energy or climate change or anything. They only wanted to know about inequality and helping unemployment, systemic risks due to COVID. And what I learned was they are focused on 3 things. One, first of all, politics. Does what we're trying to do fit my political tribe? Number 2, urgency. Is it something that we can do right now? Thinking about years and decades, which is the thesis of the scientists looking at the natural world aren't on their radar. And third, they need simple rather than complex solutions. And anything that's correct but complex is too difficult. So it is a real pickle, but that's why I think it has to be choreographed with this framework in mind, and then you get a lot of people working on it from different angles.
Thank you, Nate. I would just like to add that, well, a couple of things. On a future call, we hope to have Kim Stanley Robinson speak on his new science fiction book called The Ministry for the Future. How many of our panelists have looked at that, just out of curiosity? Has anybody taken a look at that on the panel? It's a remarkable book because it posits that the Paris Climate Treaty, after a heat event in India kills 20 million people, that the Climate Accord sets up a ministry for the future in Zurich. And it's the story of how an Irish woman politician organizes this and actually begins to turn the carbon footprint around. And it includes substantial guerrilla warfare against the sources of pollution, that planes begin to be shot down, are sunk, and so on. So I think the question that I sit with a lot is a rather simple one, which is when you look at the chat here, a lot of people are saying, you know, we need a hospice for the earth and things like that. And that's all very well, given our analysis. But a real question is, what should we tell our children about what's going on? What should we tell them? And not only for children, but how do we contribute to, we certainly can't create, but how can we contribute to a cultural context in which what is happening has meaning, of sense of hope? And I don't mean false hope, but simply a sense that there is a reason to live that is not completely darkness and annihilation. So I'd like to pose that question. Paul, let me start with you. When you, I don't know if you have grandchildren, I don't know what
I have
you do,
great
but
grandchildren.
what do you tell children or teenagers? What do you, all right, what do you tell them about what's going on?
What I tell them is whatever I consider the truth to be at the level of their age that they're able to understand it. And my general view, having taught at various levels for many years, is that people always underrate what they can understand. That is the so-called complexity of our situation, which you can look at in detail. The overall situation is easily simple enough for a middle school student to grasp. You know, it's not simple enough for Donald Trump to grasp, but it's simple enough for a child. And I think it's absolutely essential that we be straightforward about it. It doesn't mean it's dark, because you can tell them that there are goals like worldwide redistributing resources so that worldwide everybody has a decent living, shall we say. It's will be extremely difficult to do if everybody gets behind it. But the big issue is, how the hell do you get everybody behind it? And there, again, Bill sort of outlined it in a way, but basically, I think you need a new religion. We understand very well the origins of religion. Michaud pointed that out years ago. Once people understand that we're basically a small group animal, we have the wrong goals. All we have to do is stop financializing the world and concentrate on trying to keep our life support systems together and keep other people healthy and well and redistribute wealth. It'll be real easy, except somehow it doesn't turn out to be that easy. And that's the big problem. How the hell do we get the politicians to begin to understand? And as long as you have read Joel Bacon's latest book on corporations, green corporations, and so on. There are so many nonsensical ideas out there that how, for example, if we can only co-opt the big corporations, they'll do the job for us. In fact, there's almost a movement now by the big corporations to run the world with artificial intelligence. At Stanford, we had one of the great founders of artificial intelligence, and I can't remember his name, fortunately, but he was a great example of natural stupidity. We got to make, as some of us are writing right now, we need a third revolution. In other words, we had the agricultural revolution, which set us on the road to slavery and inequity and so on, and stupidity. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, which bar mitzvahed it. And we need another revolution of at least that kind of scale to change things enough to let civilization survive. And my basic understanding really comes from Schiller. If some of you may, I can't read German very well, but in Jungfrau von Orleans, he wrote, mit der Dummheit kämpfen Götter selbstvergebens, which is easily translated as, with stupidity, even the gods struggle in vain. Thank you.
Gerardo, what do you tell children and young people? What's a source of meaning and hope? You need to unmute yourself, Gerardo. There you go.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
First of all, I give a lot of talks to young children and teenagers. I'm always telling the truth, but in such a way that I always try to understand their position. Just imagine that when I was growing up, somebody will tell me that we'll be collapse in the next few decades if we don't do something. So basically, I tell them three things. And first of all, I explain how important is nature. And what I found is that the young children and teenagers, most of them really love nature and animals and so on. So I say that the world is changing, and we are trying to do our best to make it last as long as possible, and that there are many possible solutions. Some of them may happen or not. But then I say that because of the conditions, my suggestion is they should work really hard today. They should take care of themselves really hard today, and they should enjoy life really hard today. In other words, I try to give this sense of urgency in the idea that if these things change as much as we think they are going to change, today there are still a lot of things that they can enjoy. And I'm always trying to end up giving them examples of the many things that we have achieved, and at least responses that we have done that are great success stories in conservation. Because my expertise is not on population growth or in the economics. I basically related more to the biodiversity. And in biodiversity, in conservation, we have many, many great success stories that tell us that if we change as a whole, part of the political, the economic, and social systems that Paul and Bill have said, and Nate have explained, there is plenty of hope that we could at least save a large part of the species of plants and animals that have been with us throughout our evolution. And what is very impressive is most of the time, even with my own children, they do, I mean, my children now are 30 and 27 now, and they are very, very well aware of the problems, and somehow they are still hopeful. They are still full of energy trying to find solutions. That's probably the most important feedback I get from them, that I don't know how can they be so hopeful, and how can they be so trustful and so optimistic, but most of them still believe that can be changes that keep that will keep the system as the air as we know it. And my children say the other day to me that if things becomes as bad as we think, they are prepared to face it. In other words, that they don't have other option So the bottom line is I tell the truth. I try to give hope, and I also try to say that we are doing our best. Although right now our best is not enough to change the course of the problem.
Thank you so much, Gerardo. Let me just say to the panelists that we're going for another 28 minutes. I invite each of you to take any question that you would like to take. And in the final go round, I will ask each of you what question you want to address from the chat function, or if you want to address more than one, and speak to that. Bill, on this subject, which I think is just so important, what do you say to children and young people? And just expanding beyond that, what is a message about meaning and purpose that we can live with in the reality of the context that we're describing, as opposed to the unmoored fantasies that were offered?
Well, this is an absolutely huge question, of course. First of
Rees.
all, I think telling the truth is extremely important. But when I'm speaking to school children, which I do from time to time, I start from the position of recognizing that human beings will not save anything that they do not love. And if they want to feel love, they have to feel a real connection with something. So a question I often pose to kids is, where are all the bison that used to run and roam in the Great Plains of North America? And they talk about all sorts of things. And I say, no, you know what? They're actually sitting in your seats. That every one of you represents a portion of the productive ecology of the Great Plains that we've displaced bison from to feed ourselves. And then I go on to talk about how you are connected to and embedded in nature. Each of us, our whole society for that matter, is entirely a contained system of nature. So that there's no person listening to this discussion who does not contain some molecules that once ranged through the Great Plains of, say, North America or Asia in the bodies of the dinosaurs, that the material basis of life is constantly recycling, and we are totally integrated. Even though this is not part of our consciousness, the reality is that we are embedded deeply in nature. And then we turn the discussion to, if you want to love nature, love yourself. If you want to love yourself, you have to love the system that sustains you, of which you are a part. I also try to point out that, look, these are enormous problems. There are solutions, but don't get hopeful to the extent that you back off and say, well, somebody else will solve the problem. What I encounter over and over again is people who believe that technology is going to pull this off. The whole idea of the circular economy, which is a myth. The whole idea of the green, the new Green Deal is a myth. So we've got to understand the fundamental material and energy flows through the system. And on a fundamental level, kids understand that because they all eat food, they all poop, they all realize that this is their way of connecting to the real world. And over time, a consciousness, I gained it as a farm boy, of this deep connectedness to the earth becomes a part of their cognitive way of dealing with this problem. And they begin to, I suppose, open up to a capacity to love nature. I have one other comment on something I think maybe Nate started way back. I think there are three ways in which, yeah. Am I okay? Social change takes place. We are all engaged in a process of social learning here. Social learning is probably the slowest way in which change takes place, because it takes 50 years or several decades for new ideas to become embedded. Think of female liberation or even civil rights. The second major thing that causes people to be shaken from their patterned ways of thinking is catastrophe. So I suppose the paper you were talking about, Michael, earlier, the book that talks about 20 million people dying in India, that's a kind of a micro catastrophe. It's big enough to be alarming without destroying the whole system, but it woke people up. The final way is insurrection. Politicians will pay attention to revolution. In fact, if you think of the great changes in governance that have occurred over history, it's through civil unrest and insurrection or down and out revolution in the streets. So another way to get people engaged in this is once if they begin to love nature, once if they begin to truly understand the trajectory we are on, if we can get them into the streets so that they are sufficiently powerful in enforcing upon politicians the idea that our votes count more than the views of the corporate sector in whose grasp you are currently held, and then things may be able to move along. But I don't see anything short of 50 years of learning, which we don't have time to go through, a catastrophe or insurrection moving us through this. We've got to realize we are on the crisis. We may be past the tipping point where it's possible to pull off a reasoned, I suppose, controlled collapse of society. I hope not, but hope is empty unless it's filled with some action.
Thank you, Bill. Nate, before you start, same question. Actually, in my listening to you, Nate, you're actually one of the more hopeful people that I know about our potential to make important changes, of people who really get what we're talking about. And I salute you for that. But just to look ahead, I want to mention that the questions and comments in the chat function are astonishing, but I'm asking each of you to pick whatever you want from the chat function, starting with Paul. Paul, I know you said it's too small for you to read, but I'm hoping you can figure out something about it, and give you each in the last round an opportunity to address something. We will archive it, and we will continue these conversations. This is why we're here. So with that, Nate, the fundamental question, what do you tell children and young people? And as you talk to people, what kind of hope and meaning can we come together around walking through this?
So I've been working on this, Michael, as you know, for 2 decades, not as long as many of the other panelists. And around 10 years ago, I was working with Department of Homeland Security, working on these risks of financial recalibration. And I recognized that in other examples that older people between 25 and 65, they have no bandwidth for understanding or taking on board, like the Upton Sinclair quote about you can't get a man to understand something his job depends on. So I decided that I needed to not talk to professional politician type people and start from scratch with young people. So the last 7 years, I taught a class to 18, 19, 20-year-olds called A Survey of the Human Predicament. These people are old enough, they're smart enough to get it, but they're not sucked into the vortex of consumption with baby strollers and bosses and mortgages. And it is a sweet spot. I actually think we can reach people younger than that. They're smart enough and emotionally mature enough to handle a lot of this story. The problem is you could never teach the class I taught in college in a high school because the parents would be calling the principal saying, what the hell are you teaching my daughter or son? So what I tell young people is the solutions at the end of my class aren't like get a solar panel or a Prius or, go boycott something. It's all about personal reflection and changing your relationship, seeing through these bubbles that our culture has, these various blind spots, and asking them, what are the 10 best experiences of your life? How many of those were tethered to consumption or energy? Natural capital, social capital, going on a hike with your dog, and really understanding your brain and what you care about during this time. Keep in mind that as Americans, we use 100 times more energy than our bodies need to survive. Our exosomatic consumption, our footprint of coal, oil, natural gas, and other is 100 times more than the 2,500 calories you need. Europe is 50 to 1. So I'm not saying that it's going to be a piece of cake, but if we dropped in half, that would still be one of the richest generations in history. So I think the the other thing that I think is really important is we're so rich as Americans that we can live in our little castles and order Amazon delivery trucks with anything that we need. Not everyone, of course. The wealth disparity that happened from COVID is really shining a light on the inequality and the fact that a third of our country, like, people have nothing. But on average, we still live so rich that we don't need other people, and we're going to need other people again. Social capital and social nodes of communication and local networks are going to be vital in coming decades. So that's a silver lining, is that we don't need all this energy and stuff to be happy. And if you have young people forming pilots and groups and relationships and ways of doing things differently and going through it together, I think that lays the foundation of something Bill was talking about, which I agree. We have to love something in order to save it, but these cultural changes take generations. So I think young people, teenagers, squinting and seeing the human predicament and living differently and consuming differently is one of the core pieces. And I have some other things to say, but I'll stop for there.
Thank you so much, Nate. So this last round, each of you has about 3 minutes, unfortunately, to stay within our hour and a half, 90 minutes. So Paul, last thoughts, especially if you can pick a question from the chat function.
Well, there's been 500 questions on the chat conference. So my answer to all of them is, first of all, as a pedant, we have to change how we educate people in every dimension. And a starting point might be something that Bill said, which is something that I've written a lot about over time, that the idea that we're going to go back after this COVID to normal is ridiculous. We have something like a 300,000 year history as modern Homo sapiens, and there's nothing even remotely normal about the last 20, 30 years or 50 years before that, or even 100 years before that. And that's what Bill said, but it should be repeated all the time. And we need to, for example, close universities like Stanford for a year and figure out how to change its curriculum into something that emphasizes that sort of thing. Because if places like Stanford and Harvard, God save us, actually turn doing something intelligent in education, it will ricochet on down to L high and so on. Just think about it. At the moment, there's not a single university president I know of in this country who would rate as a public intellectual and saying anything about these gigantic issues which the universities ignore. So who can wonder that the teaching in the L high system is dreadful, because the people are badly trained, and there is the mother and father that call in and said, you don't understand. You're not teaching my child that the entire world is run, the entire universe is run by a supernatural monster. You know, there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on the beaches of Earth. And yet, most people in the United States think the entire thing was put together by a supernatural monster, and that supernatural monster retains a strong interest in your personal sex life. As long as you have that as the background for the world, I find it very difficult to get really hopeful. We have to make gigantic changes, and in a very short time. And until people understand that, I don't think it's going to happen.
Thank you, Paul. Gerardo, in 3 minutes, any question you want to respond to? Last comments.
Well, my last comment will be, as you all have said, this is a gigantic problem, and probably the solutions are incredibly complex and complicated to achieve. But let me tell you what I am doing based on my expertise on species extinction and population extinction. We have created a new organization, a new charity called People versus Extinction, where we are going to have 4 pillars. One is field projects. We're focusing in the most endangered species that protect the largest habitat on Earth, and we're working selecting partners so we can save millions and millions of hectares and species in the next 10 years. Second, we have created a gigantic database where anybody in the world, in a cell phone or in a computer, in a tablet, can look what species are in danger in the region and or in the country, and they can see what action can be done. Third, we are lobbying for getting a new agreement to reduce species extinction at the global level, and we have been quite successful in getting the idea through the European Union, IUCN, and so on. So we're continuing that. And finally, we're making a massive publicity campaign. We want to reach 4 billion people in the next 3 years so they understand what is the value of biodiversity, what species are at risk, why they are at risk, and what we face if we lose them. We think with the people versus extinction, we can make a massive progress about reducing the extinction rates, and that will give us more time to implement other solutions at the political and economic and social levels.
Thank you so much, Gerardo. Bill, last thoughts, especially if you can respond to one of the questions.
Well, I think it'll be a response to several of the questions, but what we have to recognize is that once a culture is formed and is based on a certain set of operating principles, then it becomes very difficult to think outside of that set of principles. Modern techno-industrial culture is a self-referencing system that is constantly seeking solutions within itself, which is why we get these ideas of geoengineering and all the sorts of technical solutions to a problem, which will only exacerbate the problem. What we have to recognize, many of the solutions that scientists propose, people say, well, that would be social engineering. What they don't realize is that we can't avoid social engineering. And in fact, all of us have been already socially engineered. The corporate sector, the advertising industry has taken a natural predisposition to consume and turned it into a cultural obsession, so that we now find our self-worth in terms of the quantity of physical goods that we manage to accumulate around ourselves. Well, of course, that keeps the economy going, but it amounts to the conversion of nature into human artifacts. That is a deadly trajectory, but it's entirely the result of social learning. We have to go back to something Nate emphasized here. We can get by on a fraction of the energy and material that we use. And in fact, if we just went back to 1960, I can't speak for the rest of the world, but in North America, that was the period in which most social science surveys showed us to be happy or very happy. And ever since then, it's been a steady decline, even as the economy has quadrupled in size and consumption per capita has more than doubled. We waste half the energy in our culture, probably more than half of the material. And when I talk about moving forward, it's moving forward to the 1960s in some sense as a first step. It's still too much, but at least it gets us to the point of recognizing that human beings were better off consuming far less than half as much per capita as we do now, even in the richest places on the planet. We have to face reality that in order for 8 billion people to survive on Earth, we would need in the first world to reduce our consumption by as much as 80%. The first half of that is easy. The next is going to be a bit more difficult, but it requires a change in attitude, a change of mind, and a complete change in the nature of the fundamental values underpinning our modern culture. We can't solve the problem from within the thinking of the corporate industrial capitalist culture. We need a different worldview. We need to be engaged in the conscious creation of a different set of beliefs, values, and assumptions out of which to operate as a planetary culture.
Thank you, Bill. And I just want to warn Joan that after Nate, I'm going to give Joan the last word as one of the co-authors of the paper and a really key contributor to all of this. Nate, you've just been referenced again. I remember you saying once that we could all live happily at the level of Costa Rica, which stuck in my mind.
Yeah, the question is how to get there. So my closing thought, I'm going to share it on my screen again real briefly. So here's a quote. "We live in a zoologically impoverished world from which all the hugest, the fiercest, and strangest forms have recently disappeared. And it is no doubt a much better world for us now that they have gone. Yet it is a marvelous fact, and one that has not been sufficiently dwelt upon, this sudden dying out of so many large mammalia, not in one place, but in half the land surface of the globe. This was not one of the authors of the Ghastly paper, but in fact was Alfred Russel Wallace in the year 1876. So we are, at risk here is ghastly, ghastlier, and ghastliest. And everything I do with my work, with my life, is to navigate natural world and some of the 10 million other species that we share this planet with through the bottlenecks of the 21st century. In response to the question I chose in the chat, there seems to be a deterministic level of doom that civilization is going to collapse. It's inevitable. It's a good thing. And without humans, the planet's going to be better off. That may or may not be true, but I think there's a false equivalence there. I personally have come to believe I started all of this work because I deeply care about other species and nature. But I determined, and I've already grieved for some of the ghastliness we already are surrounded by. I've determined that we must bend and not break, because a break in the human system, with everything we have with nuclear war and toxic chemical plants and everything, could be one of the worst scenarios for the environment. So we have to navigate this descent stepwise in order to have a better possible impact for the environment. I don't know how to do that, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have to handle it sequentially. Could any of the G20 nations, if we were sitting in a G20 meeting with Paul and Gerardo and Bill and I and others at the table, they could not take this story on board. If you presented this story to the G20, there would be a phase shift in high-level hominid response towards scarcity, and there would be wars and a grab for resources and all kinds of other chaos. So the challenge is how to navigate. The economic system is going to run out of runway, and how we respond to that is going to dictate the next choices. And a couple other questions on the chat regard to population. Population and climate change are downstream of this superorganism dynamic. And not to mention that, not only that, but we have 80 million 8-pound creatures added to the human population every year, and we have 100 million 3,000-pound creatures added to our population every year in the form of automobiles. So which is the greater ill? Is it the number of people, or is it the amount that we consume, or some combination? So I'm in the camp currently that we have to figure out how to bend and not break. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nate. Joan Diamond, last reflections as co-author of the paper, organizer of so much of the work with the Millennial Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere and the FAN Initiative and Omega. Last reflections.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone, specifically, most importantly, the panelists and Michael and Stanley for the time this morning and the opportunity to take this conversation further. But I think that one thing is very clear. It wasn't discovered in this morning's conversation by any means, but the issue is what's next? And, many ideas have been raised. If we look at the chat, and I hope, Stan, that the chat will be available very soon to people. I think people, even today, want to be able to slowly read through the different comments and the commentary and the ideas, but they reflect many, many organizations and strategies for dealing with the shared problem, our common ground, our common concern. And if we can remember that the power comes from collaboration, conversation, learning, and then collaborating, even if it's different strategies on these issues, that's where power and there's potential for change. We're not competitors. There's no, despite our conversations about truth this morning, there's no one right way, one lever if we all pulled it. But there are many levers that energize different people in different ways. Nate alluded to this in the lessons that he gives his students. So I encourage us to take advantage of the conversation this morning, of the chat this morning, to find ways to work together to build the strength from the organizations we represent, or the aloneness that we feel in our concern for these issues, and respond and find new ways to respond. So share the paper, share the conversation, and reach out to the like-minded souls who share concerns. And thank you.
Thank you, Joan. And it's interesting. We've all been on a lot of webinars, but there's something about today and this conversation and this paper. Joan, what is the number of media hits that you've had on this now?
Oh, I think the last number, Paul, that we saw was somewhere around 1,000. These are just the strict
Right.
media hits published.
Right.
What was that?
Yeah,
You're on mute.
Right.
It's about 1,000 other articles and blogs about it, and there's pushing 1 million hits when you combine it with the conversation article which summarized it. So it's one of these weird things that's gone viral, as happened to one of 3 of Gerardo and my papers in PNAS, and not the other 2. A lot depends about this unusual media structure we have, which is one of the things most of us agree needs to be changed in rather dramatic ways, but probably won't be.
Yeah.
But
So,
Paul, I think there's just one other point I'd like to make about that,
yeah.
which is that it was not in a dry news week, dry week of
Yeah,
news.
that's right.
that this paper, came out. It came out not only during, it came out during the insurrection. It came out during, new spikes and surges and fears with the pandemic. But still, the attention, the traction, and what that tells us is people are concerned. People are looking for ways to engage.
As Joan knows, we had a conversation about whether we should ask the journal to delay publication because there was so much other stuff going on that we thought it would never make news. They just published it without talking to us, and it turned out to be the right time in some sense.
Well, I just want to join Joan in thanking each of the panelists and the authors of the paper, all the authors of the paper. And to me, there's just this inner sense that this conversation has brought us together in a very useful way. So, and I especially want to thank all those who joined us. And we will conserve the chat and make it available as quickly as we can, along with the recording. We'll get that up as quickly as we can too. I encourage all of us to let other people know about this. Let them know about the paper, let them know about the recording. It just seems to me we've taken a step today, and I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us. So have a beautiful day wherever you are on this beautiful planet, and keep the faith, keep hope alive, and may we all be of service to a better world. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.
Pleasure.